In this live documentary, we are uncovering one of the darkest and least discussed chapters of modern European history. Tonight, we investigate Operation Gladio, a network of secret armies created after World War II, officially to resist Soviet invasion, but accused of manipulating fear, terror, and democracy itself. This is not theory. This is documented history. For the next 80 minutes, we will follow the trail of declassified files, parliamentary investigations, and testimonies that reveal how a hidden war may have been fought inside Western Europe against its own people. The evidence is real. The documents exist. The questions remain unanswered. Tonight we ask, was Gladio a defensive network or something far more sinister? The ashes of war. The year is 1945. Europe lies in ruins. 50 million dead. Cities reduced to rubble. Entire populations displaced. And across the continent, a single question echoes. What comes next? The answer, for Western leaders, was terrifying. The Soviet Union, having suffered unimaginable losses in defeating Nazi Germany, now controlled Eastern Europe. Soviet tanks sat in Berlin, Prague, Budapest. Communist parties were surging in Italy, France, Greece. To American and British intelligence, the specter of Soviet expansion wasn't a distant threat, it was already happening. Winston Churchill captured the moment in his famous 1946 speech. An iron curtain had descended across Europe. On one side, Soviet domination. On the other, fragile democracies, economically devastated, politically unstable, vulnerable. The communist threat real or exaggerated? But how real was this threat? In Italy, the Communist Party was the largest in Western Europe, receiving up to 36% of the vote in some elections. In France, communists participated in government. In Greece, a brutal civil war raged between communist and nationalist forces. Western intelligence agencies watched with alarm. They saw not just electoral success, but Soviet infiltration, funding, and coordination. CIA reports from the period describe elaborate networks of Soviet agents operating throughout Europe. Whether this justified what came next is one of the central questions we must examine tonight. Birth of the stay-behind concept. The concept was simple, even logical. If the Soviets invaded Western Europe, resistance networks would remain behind enemy lines. These stay-behind armies would conduct sabotage, gather intelligence, organize resistance, the same tactics the Allies had used with remarkable success during World War II, through organizations like the British Special Operations Executive. In 1948, Britain's MI6 established the Special Operations Division to create these networks. Soon after, the newly formed CIA joined the effort. The plan was coordinated through NATO Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers. Europe shaped and managed through two secretive committees, the Allied Clandestine Committee and the Clandestine Planning Committee. The hidden infrastructure. What exactly did these networks look like? Declassified documents reveal an extensive infrastructure spread across Western Europe. Hidden weapons caches buried in forests and mountains. Underground bunkers stocked with explosives, automatic weapons, communications equipment. Training facilities in remote locations. Recruitment of civilians who maintained normal lives while serving as dormant agents. A 1959 document from the Italian Military Intelligence Service SIFA, are discovered in 1990 provides rare details. The Italian network, codenamed Gladio, maintained a secret headquarters at Capo Maraggiu in Sardinia. Behind high-security fences and electric barriers, underground bunkers, shooting ranges, a small harbor, runways for aircraft, facilities for training underwater operatives. All of this completely unknown to the Italian parliament, hidden even from most government ministers. The critical question, so we understand why Gladio was created. The Cold War was real. The Soviet threat, whether one believes it was existential or exaggerated, shaped every decision Western leaders made in this period. Creating contingency plans for Soviet invasion seems, on the surface, prudent. But here is where our investigation truly begins. These networks, designed to activate only in case of foreign invasion, appear to have become active during peacetime. They appear to have operated not against external enemies, but against internal political movements. They appear to have been involved in events that shaped the political direction of democratic nations. The question we must examine: did the stay-behind networks remain purely defensive, or did they transform into something else entirely? The architects, CIA and MI6. Let's be clear about who ran these operations. The CIA and Britain's MI6 were the architects. American money, British expertise, NATO coordination. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was official, if deeply classified, Western intelligence policy. William Colby, who would later become CIA director, was stationed in Stockholm in 1951. His assignment: coordinate the establishment of stay-behind networks in Scandinavia, including neutral Sweden and Finland. Colby would later confirm in his memoirs that these networks were set up with or without the assistance of local governments. Think about that phrase, with or without. In some countries, governments knew and cooperated. In others, these networks operated completely outside official government knowledge-secret armies on sovereign territory, answerable not to elected leaders, but to foreign intelligence services. Recruitment. Who joined the secret armies? Who were these secret soldiers? This is where the story becomes deeply troubling. Initial recruits came from predictable sources: former resistance fighters, military officers, intelligence operatives. People with proven loyalty to the Western cause, training in clandestine operations, willingness to keep secrets. But as these networks expanded, recruitment patterns changed. Investigations in multiple countries revealed that stay-behind networks began incorporating members of far-right and neo-fascist groups. In Italy, connections emerged between Gladio and organizations like Ordine Nuovo, New Order, a neo-fascist group founded by former fascists. In Belgium, links surfaced to groups like Westland New Post, a private anti-communist organization with members in law enforcement. Why recruit from the extreme right? The logic was grimly pragmatic. These were people with intense anti-communist convictions, military or paramilitary experience, and willingness to operate outside normal democratic constraints. A Belgian Gladio agent named Michel van Ussel, interviewed after the network's exposure, explained, "We were thoroughly anti-communist in political orientation." But he went further, stating that Gladio wasn't just anti-communist, it was for fighting subversion in general. Fighting subversion. Think carefully about what that means. Not fighting invasion. Fighting subversion internal threats to the established order. The mission had already expanded beyond its stated purpose. The hidden arsenal. What weapons did these networks possess? Declassified documents and post-exposure investigations reveal an extraordinary hidden arsenal scattered across Europe. In Austria, weapons hidden by American intelligence in the mountains after the war became the foundation for the stay-behind network. An Austrian Nazi recruited by U.S. intelligence, Wilhelm Hodel, confirmed. The SS were confirmed anti-communists, and the Americans felt they could be relied on to fight against the Russians. In Belgium, when weapons caches were discovered in 1986, investigators found automatic weapons, explosives, bulletproof vests, and, disturbingly, evidence these caches had been accessed recently, decades after they were supposedly mothballed. The Italian network maintained the most sophisticated infrastructure. That secret base in Sardinia contained not just small arms, but facilities for training in explosives, underwater operations, sabotage techniques. Above the billiard table in one room hung a brass plate inscribed, "To the men of Gladio from Giulio Andreotti," a reminder of their protection by Italy's political elite. Code names across Europe. Each country had its own network, its own code name. its own structure. Let's map this hidden architecture. Italy. Gladio, the sword, the largest and most active network, with 622 known members when finally exposed. Belgium. SDRA, coordinated through military intelligence, but with suspected connections to paramilitary groups and elements of the Belgian gendarmerie. Germany. Unknown code name, but confirmed to exist and coordinate with NATO structures. France. Plan Bleu, though French authorities initially denied its existence before being contradicted by other NATO members. Switzerland. P-26, discovered accidentally during a separate investigation in 1990. Its existence shocked Switzerland, a neutral nation that supposedly had no involvement in Cold War intelligence operations. Spain. Networks alleged to have bases in Madrid, Barcelona, San Sebastian, and the Canary Islands. Greece. Networks that would later be implicated in the 1967 military coup that established the brutal regime of the colonels. Turkey. Deep connections between stay-behind structures and far-right nationalist groups, part of what some scholars call Turkey's deep state. The coordination structure, these weren't independent operations. They were internationally coordinated through NATO structures. The Allied Clandestine Committee, chaired by senior NATO military officers, held regular meetings. The last confirmed meeting took place on October 23rd to 24th, 1990, just days before the scandal broke in Brussels, chaired by Belgian General Raymond van Calster. When Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti revealed Gladio's existence in 1990, he stated flatly that each NATO member had similar networks. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing an integrated system that stretched across the alliance. The dual-purpose problem. Here's where we must pause and consider what we've learned so far. The official purpose of these networks was clear: prepare for Soviet invasion. But that same 1959 Cipher document that described Gladio's structure also mentioned a second purpose: to act in the absence of an invasion during any emergency situation. Emergency situation. What did that mean? Who defined it? And most critically, what actions were considered appropriate during such an emergency? These are not rhetorical questions. They lead us directly to the most disturbing allegations against Gladio, allegations supported by court findings, parliamentary investigations, and testimonies from participants themselves. The allegations that these networks didn't wait for a Soviet invasion, but instead became active participants in shaping European politics through violence and terror. December 12, 1969. The day everything changed. Let's go back to a specific moment. December 12, 1969. Milan. The Piazza Fontana. It's 4:37 in the afternoon. Inside the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura, the National Agricultural Bank, customers are conducting ordinary business. Just meters from Milan's famous cathedral, the Duomo, this is the heart of a bustling commercial district. Then the bomb explodes. Approximately 18 pounds of explosives, planted on the third floor, detonate with devastating force. The blast tears through the building. 17 people die instantly. 88 are injured, many critically. Bodies and debris scatter across the historic piazza. But Piazza Fontana wasn't an isolated attack. That same afternoon, bombs explode in Rome. Another device is discovered in Milan near Tetro alla Scala, deactivated just in time by police. This was a coordinated assault on Italian cities. The anarchist frame. Who did this? Within hours, Italian authorities announced they knew. Anarchists. Left-wing extremists seeking to destabilize Italy's democratic government. Over 80 anarchists were arrested in the following days. The investigation focused intensively on anarchist circles in Milan. One suspect, Giuseppe Pinelli, a railway worker and head of the anarchist Black Cross organization, was brought in for questioning at Milan's main police station. 3 days after the bombing, on December 15th, Pinelli fell from a fourth-floor window of that police station. Dead. The official story? Suicide. Pinelli, realizing facts had emerged undermining his alibi, threw himself from the window in despair. But when Pinelli was later proven completely innocent, the story changed. Not suicide, a medical episode. A sudden loss of balance. An accident. Another anarchist, Pietro Valpreda, was identified by a taxi driver as having been at the scene. The identification was conducted under questionable circumstances. Valpreda, disheveled and unkempt from days in custody, standing beside well-groomed police officers. The taxi driver's tentative statement, "It's either him or he's not in this room," was converted into categorical certainty. Valpreda spent 3 years in prison before being released in 1972. He was fully acquitted in 1979. He was innocent. The investigation turns. As the anarchist theory collapsed, investigators began looking in a different direction, the far right. Evidence emerged pointing to Ordine Nuovo, a neo-fascist organization founded by Pino Rauti. In March 1972, 3 years after the bombing, Franco Frida and Giovanni Ventura, both Ordine Nuovo members, were arrested and charged. The evidence was compelling. The composition of the Piazza Fontana bomb was identical to explosives Ventura had hidden in a friend's home days after the attack. The timers were traced to a stock of 50 Diehl Jungens timers that Frida had purchased in a Bologna store in September 1969, just months before the bombing. But here's where the case becomes truly extraordinary. These men, despite compelling evidence, were never successfully convicted of the Piazza Fontana bombing. Trials, appeals, acquittals, retrials, a judicial maze that would last decades. In 1987, the Court of Cassation ruled that while evidence linked these individuals to the bombing, it could not be determined for certain who planned it or carried it out. Why? What prevented successful prosecution? The Gladio connection emerges. The answer began emerging in the 1990s through multiple investigations. A parliamentary commission investigating terrorism examined the Piazza Fontana case extensively. Their findings were damning. They discovered systematic obstruction by Italian military intelligence agencies, SID and SISMI. Evidence was deliberately destroyed. The unexploded bomb discovered in Milan, critical evidence that could have guided the investigation, was detonated by police, destroying any forensic value. False leads were fabricated and fed to investigators. Then came the testimony of General Genadelio Maletti, who had been head of counterintelligence at SID during the Piazza Fontana period. In March 2001, during a trial of neo-fascists, Maletti made a stunning statement. The CIA, following the directives of its government, wanted to create an Italian nationalism capable of halting what it saw as a slide to the left, and for this purpose, it may have made use of right-wing terrorism. Maletti had been convicted in 1987 of obstruction in the Piazza Fontana case, but fled to South Africa to avoid imprisonment. Now, from exile, he was confirming what many had suspected. The bombing was part of a strategy directed by Western intelligence agencies. A 2000 parliamentary report published by Italy's center-left government stated explicitly, U.S. intelligence agents were informed in advance about several right-wing terrorist bombings, including the December 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan and the Piazza della Loggia bombing in Brescia 5 years later, but did nothing to alert the Italian authorities or to prevent the attacks from taking place. The same report revealed that Pino Rauti, founder of Ordine Nuovo, received regular funding from a press officer at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. The conclusion: so even before the stabilizing plans that Atlantic circles had prepared for Italy became operational through the bombings, one of the leading members of the subversive right was literally in the pay of the American Embassy in Rome. A strategy of tension. This brings us to a concept that will define the rest of our investigation: the strategy of tension. The term was first used in the Observer newspaper on December 14, 1969, just 2 days after. Piazza Fontana by journalist Neil Asherson. Based on conversations with Italian journalists Antonio Gambino and Claudio Rise. The concept is chillingly simple. Create fear and instability in the population through violent attacks. Blame these attacks on left-wing groups. Watch as a frightened public demands law and order, turning away from leftist political movements and supporting more authoritarian government. This wasn't idle speculation. It was a documented strategy. Swiss historian Danielle Ganser, who has conducted the most comprehensive research on Gladio, explains the concept of Gladio was based on creating chaos and fear to push European countries toward stronger, more authoritarian governments under the guise of fighting communism. May 28, 1974, Brescia. Piazza Fontana wasn't an isolated incident. The pattern continued, May 28, 1974, the city of Brescia. An anti-fascist demonstration is underway in the Piazza della Loggia. Hundreds have gathered to protest the resurgence of far-right violence in Italy. A bomb explodes in the midst of the crowd. 8 people are killed instantly. 102 are injured. The victims are exactly who the attackers intended to target: left-wing activists, trade unionists, ordinary citizens opposing fascism. Testimony from Carlo Di Giglio, a confessed explosives expert who worked with Ordine Nuovo and served as a CIA coordinator in northeastern Italy during the 1960s and 70s, revealed details of the planning. According to his testimony, he personally verified that the bomb was operational before the attack. August 2, 1980, Bologna Station, but the worst was yet to come. August 2, 1980, Bologna's Central Railway Station. A hot Saturday morning in the middle of summer holiday season. The air-conditioned waiting room is crowded with travelers seeking relief from the August heat. Families with children, tourists, students, ordinary people going about their lives. At 10:25 a.m., a suitcase bomb packed with high-quality TNT explodes with devastating force. The roof of the waiting room collapses. Most of the main station building is destroyed. The Ancona to Chiasso express train at Platform 1 is wrecked. The youngest victim is 3-year-old Angela Fresu. 85 people died. Over 200 were injured. It remains one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in European history. Bologna, the investigation that never ended. The investigation into Bologna would drag on for decades, becoming a symbol of how Gladio connections could paralyze justice. Within weeks of the bombing, arrest warrants were issued for 28 members of neo-fascist organizations. The investigation focused on nuclei armati rivoluzionari, armed revolutionary nuclei known as AR, an offshoot of Ordine Nuovo. The first trial didn't begin until 1987, 7 years after the massacre. In 1988, Francesca Mambro and Valerio Fioravanti, leading NAR members, were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But in 1990, they were acquitted on appeal. Then in a new trial beginning in 1993, they were again convicted. That verdict was upheld in 1995. Throughout all of this, Mambro and Fioravanti maintained their innocence regarding Bologna, though they admitted to numerous other killings of police officers, judges, and journalists in what they described as their war against the communist threat. One of the strange aspects of their trial, as Fioravanti himself noted, was the absence of physical evidence. The explanation offered by prosecutors was damning. We can't find the evidence because somebody has hidden the evidence. The Secret Services. So the less evidence we find, the more it demonstrates that the Secret Services were their friends. In 1987, Licio Gelli and others were convicted of planting false leads, including a second bomb discovered at Bologna Station in 1981, designed to implicate a different group of right-wing terrorists. Gelli was the head of Propaganda du P2, a clandestine Masonic lodge with over 900 members including high-ranking military officers, police, Secret Service agents, industrialists, politicians, and judges. In 2020, new investigations identified Licio Gelli as the mastermind behind the Bologna massacre. In 2021, Bologna judges, explaining their life sentence for a fourth NAR member, stated explicitly it was a political massacre, or more accurately, a state massacre. The pattern becomes undeniable. Let's step back and look at what we've documented. First, a series of devastating terrorist attacks in Italy from 1969 to 1980, killing hundreds of civilians and injuring thousands more. Second, initial investigations consistently blamed left-wing groups anarchists, communists creating public fear of the political left. Third, when evidence eventually pointed to far-right neo-fascist groups, prosecutions were systematically obstructed by intelligence services. Fourth, parliamentary investigations and court findings revealed that these neo-fascist groups had connections to Italian military intelligence and NATO's Gladio network. Fifth, U.S. intelligence was informed in advance of attacks, but took no action to prevent them. Sixth, key figures in the far right received funding from the U.S. Embassy. Paolo Emilio Taviani's admission. Perhaps the most damning admission came from Paolo Emilio Taviani, the Christian Democrat co-founder of Gladio itself. In a 2000 newspaper interview, Taviani stated that Italian secret services were aware of the planned bombing at Piazza Fontana, but rather than prevent it, they allowed it to happen. Think about what this means. The Secret Service knew. They didn't just fail to stop it, they made a choice to let innocent civilians die for political purposes. This is the strategy of tension in practice. Violence against your own population, blamed on political enemies, designed to shift public opinion toward authoritarian control. Belgium, the Brabant massacres. If Italy's experience with Gladio was characterized by bombings and political manipulation, Belgium's story is even more disturbing in its randomness and brutality. From 1982 to 1985, Belgium was terrorized by a series of attacks known as the Brabant massacres. A group of masked gunmen known as the Giant, the Killer, and the Old Man carried out over a dozen violent raids on supermarkets, restaurants, and other civilian targets across the Brabant region. 28 people were killed, 22 were injured. But what made these attacks particularly mystifying was that they appeared to have no rational motive. The killers often made off with minimal amounts of money, sometimes less than $5,000. Victims were shot execution style. The violence was gratuitous, excessive, designed to inspire maximum terror. The pattern of the attacks. Let me give you specific examples to illustrate the disturbing nature of these attacks. November 9, 1985. A Delhaize supermarket in Aalst, near Brussels. The gang bursts in around 7:30 p.m. They kill 8 people, including entire families. Gilbert and Therese van de Steen and their 9-year-old daughter Rebecca are murdered. Their son David, also 9 years old, is shot in the leg but survives. The killers take time to load 20 kilos of tea and coffee and 10 liters of cooking oil into their vehicles. Despite a supermarket alarm going off and gendarmes being nearby, the gang escapes. When police do respond, their vehicles are shot up by the fleeing killers. That supermarket in Aalst had been under surveillance, with gendarme patrols passing every 20 minutes. Yet the attack succeeded. Gendarmes close to the scene did not engage or pursue the robbers. Why? Military precision and strange protections investigators noticed immediately that these weren't ordinary criminals. The Brabant killers operated with military precision. Their tactics suggested professional training, coordinated movements, use of sophisticated weapons, escape routes planned in detail. When weapons used by the gang were eventually found in 1986 in a canal outside Brussels, the discovery raised more questions than answers. How did these criminals maintain such sophisticated equipment? Why were certain weapons never recovered? Even stranger, crucial evidence from crime scenes repeatedly disappeared. In one case, evidence collected from an abandoned getaway car simply vanished from police custody. Investigators began to suspect that someone with access to police evidence was deliberately sabotaging the investigation. The Gladio connection, when Belgium's Defense Minister Guy Combe acknowledged the existence of the Belgian stay-behind army, SDRA 8 in November 1990, he specifically demanded to know whether there exists a link between the activities of this secret network and the wave of crime and terror which our country suffered from during the past years. He was clearly referring to the Brabant massacres. A Belgian parliamentary inquiry investigated this question extensively. While they stated they found no substantive evidence that Gladio had committed acts of terrorism, their investigation revealed troubling connections. Documentary evidence showed that members of Westland New Post, a private anti-communist organization with members in the Belgian gendarmerie, had been ordered in the early 1980s to covertly assess security arrangements at Belgian supermarkets, including supermarkets that were later targeted in the massacres. Why would a supposedly anti-communist organization need detailed security assessments of civilian shopping centers? Alan Frankovich's 1992 BBC documentary on Gladio interviewed Michel Libert, the former second-in-command of Westland New Post. Libert admitted to passing on orders to assess supermarket security, though he claimed not to know what happened afterward. The Wielsum incident, perhaps the most extraordinary revelation from Belgium, came from a completely separate incident that exposed direct NATO operational involvement on Belgian soil. In 1984, according to the Belgian Senate investigation, a squad of U.S. Marines took off from an airport near London, parachuted into Belgium, and were met by an SDR A8 agent. Their mission: attack a gendarmerie barracks in Wielsum under cover of the annual NATO Oseling exercise. The operation was officially cancelled, but it went ahead anyway. One guard at the barracks was killed. Weapons stolen from the barracks later turned up in a safe house used by Belgian and French communist gangs who were being framed for violent atrocities they didn't commit. This wasn't a stay-behind network preparing for Soviet invasion. This was an active operation in peacetime, involving foreign military forces conducting violent operations on the sovereign territory of a NATO ally, stealing weapons to frame communists for crimes. The destruction of the Belgian gendarmerie, the Brabant massacres, were never solved. Despite decades of investigation, no one was successfully prosecuted. The failure to solve these crimes was so profound that it led to the complete abolition of the Belgian Gendarmerie National Institution in subsequent reforms. In 2017, Belgian Justice Minister Koen Geens acknowledged it is possible that the killings of Walloon-Brabant also targeted the state. Think about that admission. The massacres may not have been criminal acts at all, but political operations designed to destabilize Belgian democracy itself. Germany. Hidden networks. Germany's Gladio history remains among the most obscured, partly because Germany was divided throughout the Cold War, and partly because West German authorities maintained strict secrecy about stay-behind operations. What we know: Germany acknowledged having stay-behind networks coordinated with NATO. These networks were designed to operate behind enemy lines in case of Soviet invasion of West Germany. But more disturbing details emerge when we examine Germany's connections to other European violence. The 1980 Oktoberfest bombing in Munich killed 13 people. For years it was attributed to a lone perpetrator, Gundolf Kohler. But in 2014, German federal prosecutors reopened the case after evidence emerged of possible connections to a broader network. The investigation examined over 300,000 pages of evidence and interviewed over 1,000 witnesses. While prosecutors ultimately could not establish direct links to co-conspirators, they did confirm that Kohler committed a right-wing terrorist attack designed to influence West German politics. The case also revealed that crucial evidence had been carelessly or deliberately destroyed early in the original investigation. Greece. The colonel's coup. Some of the most direct evidence of Gladio involvement in political violence comes from Greece. In April 1967, a military coup overthrew Greece's democratic government, establishing what became known as the regime of the colonels, a brutal military dictatorship that would last until 1974. Coup was carried out by members of LOK, the Greek stay-behind organization. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kostas Aslanides, LOK forces took control of the Greek Defense Ministry. Over 10,000 people were arrested according to pre-prepared lists. Democracy was suspended for 7 years. When U.S. Ambassador Phillips Talbot complained that the coup represented a rape of democracy, Jack Maury, the CIA chief of station in Athens, reportedly replied, "How can you rape a whore?" That exchange encapsulates the cynicism at the heart of Gladio operations. Democratic elections, when they threatened to produce governments unacceptable to Western intelligence agencies, could simply be overthrown. Turkey, the deep state. Turkey's experience with stay-behind networks is particularly significant because it demonstrates how these structures could evolve into permanent features of governance, what scholars call a deep state. Turkish intelligence services, working closely with NATO and the CIA, developed extensive stay-behind capabilities. But these networks didn't remain dormant. They became actively involved in domestic politics, fighting not just communism, but any perceived threat to the established order. The connections between Turkey stay-behind networks and organizations like the Grey Wolves, a violent far-right nationalist group, have been extensively documented. These groups carried out assassinations, bombings, and other attacks throughout the 1970s and 1980s, creating an atmosphere of chaos that repeatedly justified military intervention in politics. The European pattern. Step back and look at the pattern across Europe. Italy, hundreds killed in bombings over 2 decades, with evidence of intelligence service involvement and protection of far-right terrorists. Belgium, 28 killed in seemingly motiveless attacks, with links to stay-behind networks and evidence of security service complicity. Greece, democratic government overthrown by stay-behind forces, dictatorship imposed for 7 years. Turkey, ongoing violence by nationalist groups connected to stay-behind networks, repeated military coups. Germany, bombing attacks with possible connections to broader networks, crucial evidence destroyed. This isn't coincidence. This is a pattern. Networks created ostensibly to resist Soviet invasion were instead being used to manipulate domestic politics, suppress left-wing movements, and maintain pro-Western governments through violence and fear. The document that changed everything. Let's return to the moment when this secret history began to unravel. The year is 1990. Italian judge Felice Casson is investigating the 1972 Piano bombing, another unsolved terrorist attack from Italy's years of lead. In January 1990, Casson requests permission to examine the archives of Italy's military intelligence service. The request is unprecedented. These archives are among the most closely guarded secrets in Italy. But in July 1990, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti grants permission. What Judge Casson discovers in those archives changes everything. A document dated June 1, 1959, formally classified top secret, compiled by SIFI, or Italy's military intelligence service at the time. The document is entitled The Special Forces of SIFAR and Operation Gladio. The document describes in detail a secret stay-behind army linked to NATO, trained by the CIA, established in Italy for unconventional warfare. The ARMIES, codenamed Gladio. The document includes lists of members, descriptions of hidden arms caches, details of training facilities, organizational structures. This is the smoking gun documentary proof of what had long been suspected but never proven. August 2nd to 3rd, 1990. Andreotti's first admission on August 2nd, 1990, the Italian Senate's Parliamentary Commission investigating terrorism orders Prime Minister Andreotti to inform Parliament about this parallel structure within 60 days. Andreotti doesn't wait 60 days. The very next day, August 3rd, 1990, he appears before the Parliamentary Commission and confirms what Judge Casson has found. Yes, A NATO-linked secret army existed in Italy throughout the Cold War, but Andreotti's initial statement is carefully constructed. He frames Gladio as purely defensive, designed only to resist Soviet invasion. He insists it was never involved in terrorism. He says the operation was completely legitimate, authorized at the highest levels of Italian government. October 24, 1990. The full revelation, 2 months later. On October 24, 1990, Andreotti appears before the Chamber of Deputies to make a more complete disclosure. He presents a 10-page report entitled the so-called Parallel Cid the Gladio case. In this report, Andreotti reveals that Gladio wasn't just an Italian operation. Stay-behind armies existed across all of Western Europe, coordinated through NATO structures. He names 622 Gladio member civilians who had operated in this secret army for decades, completely outside democratic oversight. He confirms that each head of government had been informed of Gladio's existence, but the parliament had been kept in the dark. When pressed to reveal the names of individual Gladio members, Andreotti refuses. National security, he argues. The operation, he claims, continues under NATO directives and must remain secret. The media explosion. The Italian press responds with fury. La Stampa writes, "No raison d'etat could be worth maintaining, covering up, or defending a secret military structure composed of ideologically selected members dependent upon, or at least under the influence of, a foreign power that allegedly serves as an instrument of political struggle. It cannot be defined as any less than high treason and an attack on the Constitution. The Observer in Britain calls it the best kept and most damaging political military secret since World War II. The Times observes, the story seemed straight from the pages of a political thriller, but it wasn't a thriller. It was real. The domino effect across Europe. Andreotti's revelations created a domino effect. Within weeks, similar stay-behind networks were being exposed across Europe. November 1990. Belgian Defense Minister Guy Combe acknowledges the existence of SDRA, 8 Belgian stay-behind army. France initially denies having any stay-behind network. But Andreotti reveals that French representatives had attended the most recent Allied Clandestine Committee meeting on October 23 to 24, 1990, just days before the scandal broke under the presidency of Belgian General Raymond van Calster. France's denial becomes untenable. Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Denmark, Greece, Turkey, one by one, governments across Europe are forced to acknowledge that yes, they too had secret armies. Even neutral countries weren't exempt. Switzerland discovers P-26 during investigations into its own intelligence services. Sweden confirms it had a stay-behind network, though it initially claims neither. NATO nor the CIA were involved, a claim, later contradicted by Paul Garbler, a CIA officer who had served in Sweden who stated Sweden was a direct participant in the network. NATO's non-denial denial. NATO's response to these revelations was perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire scandal. In November 1990, immediately after the revelations began spreading, NATO issued a categorical denial. No such networks existed under NATO coordination. The next day, NATO retracted the denial. Yes, stay-behind networks had existed, but they were purely defensive. A NATO diplomat was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't expect too many questions to be answered, even though the Cold War is over. If there were any links to terrorist organizations, that sort of information would be buried very deep indeed." That statement, buried very deep indeed, reveals everything about NATO's posture, not transparency, not accountability, burial. The U.S. State Department response to the United States, under President George H.W. Bush, refused to comment on the revelations throughout 1990 and beyond. It wasn't until January 2006, 16 years after Andreotti's revelation, that the U.S. State Department published a communique acknowledging that yes, NATO's stay-behind efforts existed, and yes, Gladio operated in Italy. But the communiqué flatly dismissed accusations of U.S.-sponsored terrorism. These claims, the State Department said, were rehashed former Soviet disinformation based on documents that the Soviets forged. This explanation has a fundamental problem. The evidence for Gladio's involvement in terrorism doesn't come from Soviet documents. It comes from Italian courts, Belgian parliamentary inquiries, testimonies from participants, declassified Western intelligence files, and admissions from Western officials themselves. Parliamentary investigations. Only 3 countries conducted full parliamentary investigations into their stay-behind networks: Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland. Italy's investigation, led by Senator Giovanni Pellegrino, produced extensive reports documenting connections between Gladio, neo-fascist groups, and terrorist attacks. The Commission found systematic obstruction by intelligence services, deliberate destruction of evidence, and credible testimony linking stay-behind structures to the strategy of tension. Belgium's investigation, led by Senator Roger Lallement, examined SDRA-8 and discovered disturbing facts. The network was still active in 1990. Its last coordinating meeting occurred just days before the scandal broke. Connections existed between stay-behind members and the organizations that had assessed supermarket security before the Brabant massacres. Switzerland's investigation led to the resignation of Defense Minister Caspar Villiger amid a political crisis. The inquiry revealed that P-26 wasn't just an anti-communist force, but had extremist ideological orientations far from mainstream democratic values. The European Parliament resolution. On November 22, 1990, the European Parliament passed a resolution that should have been a watershed moment in European democracy. The resolution condemned the clandestine creation of manipulative and operational networks and called for a full investigation into the nature, structure, aims, and all other aspects of these clandestine organizations or any splinter groups, their use for illegal interference in the internal political affairs of the countries concerned, the problem of terrorism in Europe, and the possible collusion of the secret services of member states or third countries. The Parliament specifically condemned NATO and the United States for having manipulated European politics with the stay-behind armies. But this condemnation had no enforcement mechanism. No NATO officials were held accountable. No CIA officers were prosecuted. The resolution was a statement of moral outrage with no practical consequence. Media silence and public amnesia. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Gladio revelation is how quickly it disappeared from public consciousness. In November 1990, when the scandal was at its height, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The world's attention shifted to the Persian Gulf. By January 1991, the first Gulf War had begun. Gladio, which had briefly been front-page news across Europe, faded from the headlines. In the United States, the story barely registered. American media gave minimal coverage to revelations that U.S. intelligence agencies had coordinated secret armies across allied nations and were credibly accused of involvement in terrorist attacks. Today, 3 decades later, Operation Gladio remains largely unknown outside of academic circles and the countries directly affected. When it is discussed, it's often dismissed as conspiracy theory, despite being confirmed by parliamentary investigations, court findings, and official government acknowledgments. What questions remain unanswered? The exposure of Gladio answered some questions but left many more unresolved. How many attacks attributed to left-wing groups were actually false flag operations conducted by stay-behind networks? What role did CIA officers play in specific terrorist attacks? Were they informed observers or active participants? Did U.S. and British officials at the highest levels authorize the use of violence against civilian populations in allied countries? Were similar operations conducted outside Europe in Latin America, Asia, Africa? Do any Gladio-style structures still exist today? These questions remain unanswered because the archives remain largely closed. Official secrecy still shrouds the full truth about Operation Gladio. Chapter 6. Conclusion: defense network, or shadow terror? 7 minutes. What have we established? Let's review what we know to be documented. Proven fact, not speculation, not theory, but confirmed historical reality. Fact 1. The CIA and MI6, in coordination with NATO, established secret stay-behind armies across Western Europe during the Cold War. These networks operated outside normal democratic oversight, often without the knowledge of elected parliaments. This has been confirmed by multiple governments, NATO itself, parliamentary investigations, and declassified documents. FAC2. These networks recruited members from far-right and neo-fascist groups, including individuals with violent extremist backgrounds. This recruitment pattern has been documented in Italy, Belgium, Spain, Turkey, and other countries. Fact 3. Multiple terrorist attacks in Europe during the Cold War, killing hundreds of civilians, were carried out by far-right groups with documented connections to stay-behind networks. This includes the Piazza Fontana bombing, the Brescia bombing, the Bologna Station massacre, and other attacks in Italy. FACT4. Italian parliamentary investigations found systematic obstruction by intelligence services in terrorism investigations. Evidence was destroyed, false leads were planted, and prosecutions were deliberately undermined. Judges and investigating magistrates have stated on record that these obstructions came from state security services. FACT5. A 2000 Italian parliamentary report stated that U.S. intelligence agents were informed in advance of terrorist bombings, but did nothing to prevent them. Pino Rauti, founder of the neo-fascist group Or Nuovo, received funding from the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Fact 6. The Belgian parliamentary inquiry established that members of organizations with links to stay-behind networks conducted security assessments of supermarkets later targeted in the Brabant massacres. The massacres killed 28 people, but remain officially unsolved. Fact 7. In Greece, the stay-behind organization LOC directly carried out the 1967 military coup that established a 7-year dictatorship. These are not allegations. These are established facts, confirmed by official investigations, court findings, and documentary evidence. The central question: was Gladio defensive or manipulative? So we return to our central question. Was Operation Gladio a legitimate defensive network preparing for Soviet invasion? Or was it a tool for manipulating democratic politics through violence and fear? The answer appears to be both. There is no reason to doubt that Gladio was initially created with the genuine defensive purpose its founders claimed. The Soviet threat was real. The possibility of Soviet invasion of Western Europe was a legitimate concern that shaped all Western military planning during this period. But somewhere between 1948 and 1990, these networks evolved. They expanded their mission from preparing for external invasion to conducting internal operations against domestic political movements. The evidence for this mission creep is overwhelming. The most damning fact: these networks were never activated for their stated purpose. The Soviet Union never invaded Western Europe. Yet the networks remained active, conducting operations, maintaining capabilities, coordinating through NATO structures. What were they doing for 40 years if not preparing for an invasion that never came? The strategy of tension, deliberate or emergent? The most difficult question to answer definitively is whether the strategy of tension was a deliberate policy coordinated from the top, or whether it emerged organically from the intersection of zealous anti-communism, operational autonomy, and plausible deniability. We have no smoking gun document that says CIA headquarters orders the bombing of civilians to discredit the Italian Communist Party. What we have instead is funding flowing from U.S. intelligence to far-right groups that carried out attacks, advanced knowledge of attacks by intelligence agencies without preventive action, systematic obstruction of investigations into these attacks, protection of individuals involved, a pattern that repeats across multiple countries over decades. This creates what intelligence agencies call Plausible deniability. Senior officials can truthfully say they never directly ordered specific attacks while creating the conditions, providing the resources, and ensuring the protection that made those attacks possible. Democracy under threat. Whatever the precise mechanism, the effect was the same. Secret, unelected networks, operating outside democratic control, manipulating the political direction of democratic nations through violence. This poses a fundamental challenge to our understanding of Cold War democracy. We're taught that the West defended democracy against Soviet totalitarianism. But Operation Gladio reveals that Western intelligence agencies were willing to subvert democratic processes, use terrorism against civilian populations, and protect fascist groups, all in the name of defending democracy. The Italian Senate, after examining the evidence, concluded that Gladio was beyond democratic control and therefore had to be closed down. That phrase, beyond democratic control, captures the essential problem. These were state resources, funded by taxpayers, supposedly acting in the national interest, but answerable to no elected body, operating according to secret directives, pursuing goals that may have directly contradicted the democratic will. The victims who never got justice. We must not lose sight of the human cost of these operations. 85 people killed at Bologna Station, 17 at Piazza Fontana, 8 at Brescia, 28 in the Brabant massacres, hundreds more in attacks across Europe, thousands injured, families destroyed. These weren't soldiers killed in combat. They weren't intelligence operatives who accepted risk. They were bank customers, train passengers, grocery shoppers, demonstrators exercising their democratic rights. They were killed to create fear. They were killed to manipulate politics. They were killed by people who were supposed to protect them. And in most cases, their killers were never held accountable. Trials dragged on for decades. Convictions were overturned. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses died or fled. The machinery of justice was systematically obstructed by the same state apparatus that had enabled the violence. The families of victims in Bologna, in Belgium, across Europe, have spent decades fighting for truth and justice. Many have died without getting answers. Their persistence, their refusal to let these crimes be forgotten, has kept the memory of Gladio alive despite institutional efforts to bury it. What accountability has there been? The simple answer, almost none. A few low-level operatives have been convicted neo-fascist terrorists carrying out attacks. But the intelligence officers who coordinated with them, the NATO officials who ran the stay-behind networks, the CIA officers who provided funding and support, the senior politicians who authorized these operations, none have faced criminal prosecution. None have been held accountable. Most have taken their secrets to the grave. Giulio Andreotti, who ran Gladio for years and later exposed it, was celebrated as a statesman. He died in 2013 at age 94, never prosecuted for his role in these operations. Francesco Cossiga, who admitted being proud and happy for his part in setting up Gladio, served as president of Italy until 1992 and died in 2010. The message sent by this lack of accountability is clear. If you reoperating at a high enough level in intelligence services, if your actions can be cloaked in national security, you're effectively above the law. Questions still unanswered today. As we conclude this investigation, we must acknowledge how much remains unknown. Were there Gladio-style operations in countries that haven't been exposed? What about France, where initial denials proved false? What about Britain, where Parliament never investigated despite MI6's central role? Were similar stay-behind networks established in other regions where the U.S. feared communist influence, Latin America, Asia, Africa? Operation Condor in South America showed similar patterns of intelligence coordination, state terrorism, and protection of right-wing death squads. What happened to the weapons caches? Were they all recovered and destroyed? Or do some remain hidden across Europe? Most troubling, are there current intelligence operations being conducted today under similar logic secret operations, outside democratic oversight, using violence or manipulation to shape political outcomes, all in the name of national security? The lesson of Gladio. What should we take from this history? First, secret power corrupts. Networks operating without democratic oversight will inevitably expand their missions, justify extreme actions, and protect themselves from accountability. Second, the ends don't justify the means. Even if we accept that containing communism was a legitimate goal during the Cold War, that doesn't justify bombing civilians, protecting terrorists, or subverting democratic elections. The moment we accept that logic, we've surrendered the very principles we claim to defend. Third, historical truth matters. The effort to bury the Gladio story, to dismiss it as conspiracy theory, to let it fade from memory, this isn't just about the past. It's about establishing the principle that intelligence services can operate beyond democratic control without consequence. Fourth, democracy is more fragile than we think. These weren't operations conducted by rogue elements. They were coordinated at the highest levels of NATO, supported by multiple intelligence services, protected by political leaders. The institutions we trust to defend democracy were, in this case, actively undermining it. Final question. Has anything changed? The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The existential threat that supposedly justified Gladio disappeared. But has the mindset that created Gladio disappeared? Do intelligence agencies still believe they have the right to operate outside democratic control? Do they still believe that certain threats justify any means? Do they still believe they can decide what information the public should or shouldn't know? The lack of accountability for Gladio suggests the answer may be yes. When an operation this extensive, this damaging to democracy, this connected to civilian deaths, produces no meaningful consequences for those who ran it, what lesson do intelligence services learn? They learn that they can get away with it. Tonight, we have examined one of the darkest chapters in post-war European history. We have followed the documentary Trail Declassified Files, parliamentary investigations, court findings, testimonies from participants. We have established facts that are no longer in reasonable dispute. Operation Gladio was real. It operated across Western Europe for 4 decades. It recruited from extremist groups. It had connections to terrorist attacks that killed hundreds of civilians. It operated outside democratic control. When exposed, it was buried rather than properly investigated. These are not conspiracy theories. These are historical facts. But we must also acknowledge what we don't know. We don't have complete access to the archives. We don't have testimony from all the key decision makers. We can't prove beyond all doubt every connection between Gladio structures and every terrorist attack. What we can say with certainty is this: democratic governments, working with NATO and American intelligence, established secret armies outside democratic oversight. These armies became connected to political violence. When this was exposed, rather than full transparency and accountability, we got denial, obfuscation, and ultimately silence. The question we must each answer: is this the kind of democracy we want? One where secret operations are conducted in our name, without our knowledge, answerable to no elected body, capable of using violence against civilians, and immune from consequence? Or do we demand something better? Do we demand that democratic values actually govern how democracies operate, including in the shadows, including in the realm of intelligence and national security? The victims of Gladio, from Piazza Fontana to Bologna, from Brescia to Brabant, never got the justice they deserved. The least we can do is remember their stories. The least we can do is demand that history like this never be repeated. The least we can do is remain vigilant against secret power operating without democratic accountability. Because Operation Gladio teaches us a critical lesson. The greatest threat to democracy sometimes comes not from external enemies, but from those who claim to be defending it. Thank you for joining this investigation. the questions remain open. The search for truth continues.